As he said, you know, I'm both a home inspector and Class A electrical contractor. I started my electrical business in '08, started in inspections, 2010. One of the things that I try to stress when I'm talking to them like this is basically, you know, inspecting correctly, you're looking at electrical things and using the proper terminology because, you know, we all have gotten this complaints from sellers, listing agents, you know, hey, you said this, and the contractor disagreeing with you and saying that. And so I've kind of over the years put together, some statements to put in reports, you know, things to kind of stay away from, things to, you know, call for, you know, extra evaluation or not call for extra evaluation. And then helping with, you know, being more comfortable inspecting certain things, being more comfortable with having conversations about certain aspects and, you know, what to say and what not to say and that kind of thing. Those of you that were at the Tech Talk or logged into the Tech Talk in Williamsburg back a while back, some of this is going to be a repeat, but I wanted to talk about a couple things that I haven't ever gone over and kind of start off with that, and then we'll fill the rest of the time with things that I've gone over in past classes and stuff. How many of you all have updated your agreements to talk about what you do and don't do with EV chargers and or solar? And we're seeing a lot of that. Are you guys putting in what you do and don't do with those? I don't know. Keep in mind, we'll talk about the solar first. We've been running into a lot of solar remorse, is what I call it. We've had 2 deals in the last 2 months where the seller, you know, I guess they were planning on staying there much longer than they did. They still had a big solar loan on the house that, contrary to what some people tell you, most of those are not transferable to the new owner. So the solar salesman comes out and knocks on your door and he says, hey, you know, what are you paying in your electric bill? Well, I can work you a deal where your solar payment is going to be less than what you're paying in your electric bill. So it sounds like a win-win, but you know, these payoffs are, you know, pretty long-term on the loans. And then, you know, they get transferred or, you know, life happens and they have to move. And next thing you know, we've got a big solar balance that has to be remedied for the house to sell. So, you know, a big part of inspecting solar that I've warned other inspectors about is, you know, you really shouldn't be opening up any of that equipment. If you're not, you know, trained in solar, like you really should be calling for it to be evaluated. It's something that you definitely want to get someone specializing in that to look at. Because a lot of these components are, you know, way more complicated than you really need to be getting into. And solar contractors, you know, one of the biggest complaints I'm hearing from people is they call and ask, like, do you work on solar? And I immediately say, no, we don't touch it. But basically they're saying, well, I can't find anybody to come out and work on this stuff because the company that put it in, you know, they went out of business a couple years ago. You know, a lot of these companies are, you know, selling the equipment. They have little interest in even installing it. And they have zero interest in coming back in 3 to 5 years and working on it and warrantying it. So a lot of unhappy solar customers are in a pickle. And what happens when people are in a pickle and they start looking for, like, who could I possibly look at? Oh, that home inspector that looked at the house a couple of years ago, he told me he looked at it, but, you know, I'm finding this, and this wrong. I urge inspectors to call for a further evaluation on solar, and just kind of keep their clients, you know, like say, hey, you might want to look into who installed this. Are they still in business? What kind of warranty is this? And, you know, a lot of roofers will tell you that, you know, a lot of solar companies are ruining good roofs. But I mentioned a few deals that we've had fall through recently. Both of them were solar panels that were installed on houses within the last 4 years. Both houses had roofs that were shot when we went to do the inspection. there were more granules in the gutters than there were on the shingles. Cracks, blistering, like you name it, it was a roof replacement every time. They're not even a borderline judgment call. These were just the first look, and it's like, hey, this is a roof replacement. And both of these houses, the solar loan was still over $50,000. So I got a very angry call a few weeks ago from a homeowner who said I was, ruining her life because they had put the solar on there 4 years ago. It was a small starter house, and they were having to pay off the solar loan as part of the closing. And tearing the solar off, putting a new roof on, and putting all the solar back on was going to completely, blow them up financially. So, my best advice when it comes to solar, I get other inspectors call me all the time. Like, what do you do with solar? Like, what can you tell me about solar? What I can tell you is make sure your agreement says that it's not in your scope, and make sure in your report you tell them that you didn't inspect it and to get somebody out there to look at it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do, if you see something along the way, if you see that, like when they brought the wire into the panel, they didn't use a connector, or, you see some stuff that looks suspect, that doesn't mean you can't just put it in there and say, hey, I didn't inspect the solar panels and I didn't inspect the associated equipment, but here's what I'm seeing. But I would strongly advise you to update your agreements if you don't have something mentioned about solar. The next thing that I'm getting a lot of questions about recently is EV chargers. You need to decide what you're doing or not doing with EV chargers, because you're going to start seeing them more and more. We've probably installed, I'd say 60 or 70 of them at this point. And I figured I would talk about those a little bit today, because I'm sure you'll get questions about them, and the more you can have a conversation with them, the better usually. But you shouldn't be opening them up. There's a lot of sensitive components to these things. There's dip switches. There's all kinds of things that you don't want to mess with. Some of them even have special bits that come with them to even get into them. So I wouldn't even promise people that you'll, pop the face off of it and look at it. But what I tell people about EV chargers is don't be intimidated by it, and just, inspect it like you inspect other things. If it's in a garage, it doesn't have proper conduit going to it. You can't have an end cable running across the drywall exposed. I mean, that's stuff that we're already looking at. I already mentioned like connectors coming into the panel, appropriately sized wiring and breakers, that kind of stuff. So just do your normal electrical look over, but have language in your agreement and your report as to what you do and don't do. I had an inspector recently ask me about like, oh, well, what about the ends? And do you look at all that? I mean, they make adapters and stuff. I would just stay away from that conversation. We just installed a Cadillac EV charger the other day, and he was telling me that, because he spent like $90,000 on this Cadillac electric SUV, that he made them throw in like every adapter that they had at the dealership for free because of what he was spending. So most of the time, somebody can get an adapter or whatever to make it work with their car, but that's not a conversation, you need to be having. You got a limited few hours to look at a whole house anyway. I wouldn't spend too much time trying to talk about what model their car is versus what chargers on the wall. I'm seeing a lot of.
You tested for output at all in the meter?
No, I mean, some of them will have like lights on the side, on the front of them that show that they're ready. Like the Tesla ones will have like a little green, bar on the front of it. So you could look at that, but you shouldn't be pulling the cover off or doing any of that stuff anyway. I wouldn't be sticking your meter up inside the, the plug. And if you're opening up the panel and stuff, unless you're putting a meter on every breaker, I don't see the need to put a meter on that one. But I am seeing a ton of like homeowner installed chargers. So it would probably be in your best interest to look at just the basic electric of it. Is the breaker oversized? Is the wire undersized? Do they run the wire properly? Is it in a conduit? All those things. Look at that, but I wouldn't get into like makes and models and what's compatible and all that. One of the biggest things I'm seeing is either the wrong size breaker or undersized wiring in these things. I had a homeowner called me a while back and he was kind of ticked off that I had written up that his EV charger was installed improperly. And he let me know, like they always do, he let me know that he was an engineer, like in the first, he like said his name and then that he was an engineer. And I just, I just listened, I just let him go ahead and do his spiel, but he had put a 60 amp breaker in the panel and he had run number 8 wire to the charger. And once I told him like, hey, I don't wrote up that you put undersized wiring in it, he was like, oh, well, you can program the car to only charge at a certain amperage. So like, I know to do that. But my argument there is, the next person, they don't know that. They're gonna come in there with their car on full charge, and that breaker's not gonna trip when it's supposed to. I mean, and literally the car charger was like 40 feet away from the panel. He'd say, 50 cents on the wire. I mean, it was ridiculous. But the agent went round and around about this. And I said, hey, just, downsize the breaker, upsize the wire. And he ended up, and I told him like, you really should just run the correct size wire and have it right from the beginning. And instead of, lowering the ampacity that your car charges at, because he's, most Teslas and stuff, if you have like one of those stage 2 wall mount chargers, you're looking at about 3 hours to charge it if you're pretty low. And they don't charge up to 100. They don't recommend going up to 100. But a lot of people that park it in the garage at dinner time, plug it in and don't mess with it until the morning. Sometimes they don't charge it on full power. Sometimes they make it so that it comes on in the middle of the night at like less peak hours. And there's all kinds of ways to play with those in the app for the car. And he was like, oh, well, I know I've got it set to charge at 30 amps, which is below the 80% of the number 8, but I just put the 60 amp breaker on it. And we went around and around and around, and finally the agents agreed to let him put a 40 amp breaker in it and then label the charger saying, don't charge your car above this or it'll trip the breaker. I mean, as silly as that was, there was 4 feet of wire. That's what the agents came up with. So, I mean, a lot of this stuff is stuff to just kind of stay away from, but just, look at the basic electrical that you're already looking at, and leave it at that.
Is it a standard breaker size and wire size for different charging units?
Yeah, I mean, they make different level chargers, like we've installed the smaller Tesla chargers that are meant to run off 30 amps. Most of like your wall mount ones, most of the ones I've seen are 60 amps. And he said, oh yeah, well the manual said to put a 60 amp breaker, so that's why I did it. And I was like, well, the first sentence in most of the manuals say you have a licensed electrician install it. So I suggest you stay away from the manual and just talk with me. But
Is it listed somewhere on the charging unit? What size breaker?
usually it's in the manual. So I mean, I get into these talks all the time where people, say, hey, well, this is code, but how many times have you heard that, hey, well, manufacturer's recommendations and, on page 67 of the manual say that this is okay. I tell my guys, write up what is correct, wire sizes and breaker sizes and stuff. If they want to prove us wrong on page 77 saying that the manufacturer is allowing this loophole, like they can do that. But, we're not going to go through a house and look at the installation guide of every HVAC unit and EV charger, solar panels and all this stuff. You have to stick with, wire size, breaker size, all the correct stuff. So any other questions about EV chargers, solar panels?
So Joe, the standard is 60 amps versus 30 amp?
There's no, I'm not gonna say it's standard. I mean, they make different sizes.
Okay.
That's why I would just inspect, the basic electrical that you see. I mean, for example, the Tesla chargers and most of the kind of hybrid ones that you can buy on Amazon that, are for multiple different cars. for example, we had installed, dozens of these things, and most of them are just 240 volt, no neutral. Two hots, no neutral in the ground. That's the 2 hots in the ground, that's it. And then we showed up to do that Cadillac one, which was the first Cadillac one that we've done, and it required a neutral. So, I mean, calling something standard is a dangerous thing to tell somebody, hey, and then they've got the one charger that's a little different than what we've seen. I mean, I've seen a lot of different variations on amperage sizes. I've seen 30 amp, hey, put in a 30 amp breaker. I've seen 50s and I've seen 60s. You've got the plug-in ones in the wall that, you can plug into your dryer outlet, with all these different adapters. Some of these guys are riding around with 4 or 5 different adapters in their trunk, like the RVers that pull up, and no matter what kind of plug they have, they can mix and match all these things and make it work. There's a lot of EV people riding around with that in their trunk because they plugged into their in-laws dryer when they were, visiting out of town, or, they can pull up at a campground and plug into an RV plug and, put some adapters on. One question that you might get about EV chargers is, a lot of times they're outside or in garages, obviously. A lot of them do have GFCI protection built into them, but that's another thing that, I wouldn't get into this make or this model. But if somebody asks you that question, just to be able to answer it, if there's not a GFCI breaker in the panel, that doesn't mean it's not GFCI protected. Most of them that we've run across have built-in GFCI protection inside of it. One of the things that we've been seeing builders do is they're putting just, 4-prong 50 or 60 amp outlets in the garage. And they're saying, oh, we've already got you covered if you have an EV, because you can just come in and use the plug-in one. Most counties are enforcing GFCI protections on those. So we've written up a lot of those where people have installed these plugs in the garage or on the outside of the house, and they're not doing GFCI protected. A 60 amp regular breaker, you're looking at about $30 depending on the manufacturer, and those GFCIs are about $130. So that's a quick $100 savings that people have been, trying to get away with. We did one the other day that they had put one on both sides of the garage. Neither one of them were GFCI protected. So any other questions about EV?
On a related topic, the receptacle for a backup portable generator. Any experience or comments with regard to that, as opposed to the?
I've been doing those for 15 years. I can tell you anything you want to know.
Yes,
when you say like any comments, what do you mean?
Well, we look for, obviously we're looking for safety to ensure that there's either a manual lockout or a transfer switch. And I recall we did one inspection, and it was an electrician, and he didn't have a safety device put in. But he said, I don't need it. I said, well, I know you don't need it, but the next person might need it.
You're preaching to the choir, because every electrician, you go to an electrician's house, you're gonna find stuff like that, because they know how to do it.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna go ahead and make my confession now. I backfeed my house from my garage, so like I don't have an interlock in my own house, because I backfeed it, from the garage to the house. You can't, the breaker for the generators in one building and the mains and dominions in another building. You can't have an interlock for that. So, I mean, when you're inspecting an electrician's house, the whole like, oh, he's an electrician, why in the world would he do that? I can tell you right now, I've known electricians, for my whole adult life, and unfortunately, electricians are some of the smartest people you'll ever meet. And electricians are some of the dumbest people you'll ever meet. It just depends on which one you're meeting. So like to your point, like safety wise, what we see a lot is we see, no interlock in the panel or transfer switch. Obviously we've all seen that a lot. You should be looking for that. A lot of times people will run SO cord in the wall. You're supposed to have actual NM cable or proper wiring from that generator breaker to your inlet box. A lot of times, they'll show up with a 50-foot cord, and they'll make their cord, and then they'll use the other 5 feet of it to go from the inlet box into the panel. You can't have the SO cord coming into the panel. Like you're supposed to have actual like house wiring. SO cord is meant for like a temporary flexible cord. So we see that a lot, so that's something to look for. From there, I mean, everybody's seen just a male plug hanging out the wall under the panel. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen that at this point, so, I mean, that's obviously wrong. And you know, no interlock and all that stuff, so I tell people all the time, like, you flip this breaker, you're just holding hot male prongs, you know, we see that all the time. So in terms of like, you know, portable generators with the back feed, you know, we've literally seen any conglomeration, because a lot of times those are homemade.
All right, thanks.
Are you allowed to raise change if the outputs, like two outputs on one rate, or have to be one?
It could be a home run. I mean, anytime you're dealing with that stuff, I mean, you don't want to try to.
It should be, but it's zero.
No, you shouldn't. I mean, if they're gonna like junction it and have two of them or whatever, I don't know, like a code saying you can't go from one to the other, but obviously, like, you're not gonna be able to charge two cars at one time. If they wanted to have like two different locations, like one in the garage and one on the outside. But I mean, anytime you have those big 240-volt circuits, like, it should be a home run.
Okay, but technically it's not a problem as long as they know that they can charge both.
Yeah, I mean, but from a code perspective, like your oven, like all those bigger things, it has to be a home run. You're not supposed to be daisy chaining them. So I don't know that it specifically states that in the code yet about an EV charger, but just a rule of thumb, all those big 240-volt circuits, they're home runs. So I would assume that if that's not already in the code, it will be soon. Cause I've seen people daisy chain off the dryer, like, you know, a lot of times you have a laundry room backing up to the attached garage. And I've seen it several times where they tapped into the dryer receptacle and put a EV, like a plug on the outside to plug their car into. And obviously, if you don't have the car charging and the dryer on at the same time, it will work. But you shouldn't, obviously you shouldn't be doing that. I mean, any user installation is gonna say, you know, home run, you know, this size wire, this size breaker to your charger or the outlet that you're using for your charger. So I haven't seen that in the manufacturer's instructions. To answer your question, I don't know if they've updated the code to include that. Any other solar or EV? All right, so, one of the things that so I talked about, you know, kind of the more you know, the less callbacks you get, you know, saying one word versus the other. I've put together stuff over the years on that. Some of that's been, you know, callbacks on myself and my own guys of, you know, hey, you said this word and it would have been better if you said that word. And, but some updates that, this one. Okay. So everybody still hear me good? No. What's that? You're in the front, you can't say that. It was better the other way? Yes. Yeah, you just stand back a little bit, just use that one. Turn it. Good? Yes. Okay. So I did this one back at the tech talk, but most like Enrico, Richmond, all them, as of the first of the year, they updated, you know, what code they're on. So a lot of stuff you're going to be seeing different in new construction. You know, GFCI protection extended for 240-volt receptacles, dryers, ranges, et cetera, within 6 feet of sinks, as well as for basements, whether they're finished or not. So depending on what jurisdiction you're in, you're probably seeing some of this stuff already where, you know, if there's a slop sink next to the dryer, you're going to be seeing GFCI breakers start popping up in the panels. Surge protection devices. You know, if you're doing a flip house, we all know that there's probably not many permits pulled on, you know, all these flips that people are doing. But if they've got a brand new electrical panel in Enrico, Richmond, most of the areas around here, they should have a whole house surge protector in the panel. You know, if they're bragging about a new panel and you're not seeing surge protection, stuff like that, then you know right off the bat that no permit was pulled and, you know, maybe you're looking a little closer, I mean, you look close regardless. But if you get that question of, do you think this was permitted or not, some of these are telltale signs. So the surge protective device at the service is one thing, but all 1 and 2 family dwelling units must now have an emergency disconnect on the outside. So who can tell me how the disconnects used to work? When you saw a disconnect on the house in the past, what did that mean? It meant the panel was further away than 6 feet. So now if you're seeing a disconnect, it might be on the backside of the wall, but basically I find it weird that it took all this time because they're putting it on there for emergency responders. I was on the volunteer fire department when I was younger, and they had me as the designated guy when we pulled up to a house fire. I had to go to the meter and pull a live meter out while everybody started to charge hoses and spray water. That was fun. So, you know, they have all these little intricate rules about electrical, and now all these years, they're finally, you know, doing away with the safer way of the fire department being able to show off and cut the power off before they start, you know, putting hooks through the wall and spraying water on literally everything. So as someone who's been in that situation, I thought that code update was well overdue. But again, if you're, you know, at a flip house or whatever, and they're bragging about all new electrical, all new service, all that stuff, and there's not a disconnect on the outside of the house, then none of it was permitted. Right?
Recently I saw a house that had, it was a new house that had a disconnect outside and in the panel, and then it wasn't set up as a sub panel. So how do you handle that?
So that's a question I get a lot, and that's later in the presentation. I don't know if we'll get there or not. I get a lot of questions about grounding, and this is a huge thing that I get questions about is, you know, where do we separate grounds and neutrals? How do we do that? The first stop after the meter is your main service, period. So that disconnect, wherever it goes from the meter into that disconnect, like that's your main service. So your number 6 Bayer that goes out to the ground rod should be coming into that disconnect, not the panel inside. If you have an older house that has copper plumbing, they should have run a number 4 down and gone to the cold water pipe within 3 feet of where there's the house. Those ground wires that you used to look for in the panel inside are now going to be in that disconnect on the outside because that is the main service. The main service is where your neutrals and grounds are bonded together, and anywhere past that, they have to be separated and the neutral has to be isolated. And I see a lot of people not catch it or write it up wrong, because has anybody seen the ground bonding screw that goes in these panels? It's usually like top right, that's usually where it is. A lot of times electricians will leave it laying in the bottom of the panel if it's a sub panel because it comes with it, but most of us leave it laying in the bottom so if it's ever repurposed, it's not just missing. So to answer your question, with the panel still being inside, and even if you have a main breaker at the top or not, that's irrelevant.
Okay.
You should have a separate ground and neutral leaving that disconnect. So you have, you know, your 2 hops, you have your neutral, and you have your ground in the panel once you get inside. You don't have your grounding electrodes going out to the ground rods, the copper plumbing. The bonding screw, that green screw, should not be installed in the panel inside. And you have to make sure that the ground and neutral are separate. A lot of times what I see people miss is that there's a jumper between the 2 bars. You got a bar going down one side of the panel, you got a bar going down the other. And they pull the bonding jumper out, they'll put all the neutrals down one side, all the grounds down the other, but you got a big bar going across the top that's connected to both of them, so they're still hooked together. Or, you know, the little bonding piece that goes, like it's screwed to the back of the can and it loops up real quick and goes into the bar. You know, that should be uninstalled if that's the neutral bar. So yeah, not only does it have to be separated, but the neutral has to not be bonded to the can at all or grains. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, that's good to know because I didn't know which way to go on it. Since it was new construction, I figured and it's probably correct, but yeah, obviously it wasn't.
All right, Mike, I'm gonna pin on you for a second. I had an inspection from the county a few months ago, and the whole new construction is correct. That's a dangerous statement. because, this was the longest inspection I've ever had in the county. The guy was out there for over 2 hours, which is, I mean, most county inspectors just drive by, you know, if you blink, they're gone. But this guy went throughout the whole house. It was an upscale house. We had really gone way above and beyond. It was, you know, 2 ovens, 4 fireplaces, hot tub, EV charger, you know, smart home stuff here and there. I mean, it had a lot to it. And this guy, he must have had a lot of time because, like I said, he was there for over 2 hours. He tested every receptacle in the house. We put AFCI, GFCI combo breakers on every single circuit in the whole house. So there was not a GFCI with a push button anywhere. It all was in the breaker. He sat there and tripped every circuit and made sure that it was to the corresponding breaker, it was on the right circuit. He did all that. But guess what he didn't do? He didn't take the panel covers off. So how many builders are trying to keep us out of panels now? And we got I don't like to say names, look all tones, but they sent us a contract the other day that was like, can't go in the attic, you can't walk on the roof, can't take the electrical panel cover off. You have to go over findings before you leave. I mean, it was like, do they want my firstborn for me to even like come on site? Like, we're now carrying hard hats because they're, you know, requiring that. I mean, it's a lot of stuff. But one of the big things is a lot of builders are prohibiting home inspectors from going into the electrical panel. Well, the county does not open the electrical panel at final. So I've got news for you. There's a lot of white wires on breakers that aren't, you know, they don't have the pieces, they're not phased, you know, like they don't color them or put the tape on them. That is not checked at rough in, obviously, because it's just a can with wires rolled up in it. And it's not checked at final. Wire side of the home breaker, that's not checked at final. So I mean, HVAC breakers going to outdoor units, you know, we find a lot of those breakers that are not properly sized. You know, we see a lot of like, I mean, it's the phase in the white wires. That's one of those things that just pisses everybody off. I get it, you know. But yeah, the whole new construction is probably right. Anything in that panel has not been looked at usually, unless you're looking at it. Go ahead.
New construction, if they're considered sub panels on the inside, the ground wire is coming within about 1/8 of an inch of the neutral bus bar. How would you write that up, or would you?
You're talking about just like the wires are running close to the neutral bar?
Yeah, right.
And that's just, I mean, if you feel like, I mean, anybody that is behind that cover should be somewhat a qualified professional. So I mean, if it's not touching, I mean, think about how many receptacles and switches that you shove back in the wall and the wires are, you know, close but not touching or whatever. That's one of those battles that I probably would pick. Now, I mean, if it's touching or something, you know, you can either write it up or take your flat blade and bend it over a little bit. But you know, if you're writing that up, you're probably going to get a lot of comments back saying, hey, like it's not touching, so it's fine. So anything on panels and sub panels since we got on that topic about the disconnect on the outside? All right, so I'm sure you all run into this already, but tamper resistance been required, you know, like in the house. But now they're requiring an attached and detached buildings, accessory buildings, common areas, multifamily dwellings. You know, there's some. They're not just, you know, required like in the main dwelling anymore. They're now extending that to garages and detached buildings and stuff like that.
Those things are a pain in the ass. You can't get through the test with it.
I agree.
So what is a tamper resistant receptacle?
Tamper resistant is where you can't just stick like a paper clip in one side. Both prongs basically have to be pushed at the same time. Like where you're actually plugging something in. So basically what it prevents is a kid, you know, taking a screwdriver or a paper clip and, oh, look at this, look it right, you know.
I got you.
You know, they're putting it in there like a coin into a candy machine.
I didn't know that was the name.
Yeah, tamper resistant. So just while we're going over, some new code stuff and stuff, you're gonna be seeing in new builds. This is some stuff that's kind of on the horizon. Things that you're gonna be seeing in the next couple of years as they update things. GFCI protection extended to all kitchen receptacles, not just those on the countertop surfaces, including those serving wall-mounted ovens, counter-mounted cooking units, clothes dryers, and microwave ovens. So basically, everything in the kitchen soon is going to be GFCI protected. The code is now basically specifying that appliances that are listed needing GFCI protection, regardless of whether they're hardwired or plugged. So, you're going to be seeing, plug-in ranges and stuff. You're going to be seeing GFCI breakers and panels soon. But even stuff that just gets hardwired via a junction box, like slide-in ovens and things that just have that you just wire nut in a box and behind the appliance. Cooktops that have, the greenfield conduit just coming up to it, and, they're not actually like a cord that you plug into a receptacle. They're now extending GFCI protection to hardwired things, not just plug-in appliances. So that's going to be on the horizon in a few years when they adopt that. AFCI protection extended to all 15 and 20 amp 120 volt circuits throughout the house, with the exception of bathrooms, garages, and exterior. Basically, what you're going to be seeing a lot of is just panels full of combination breakers. Because the exceptions that they just listed, those are already supposed to be GFCI anyway. It's getting harder and harder to find non-combination breakers. When we want to GFCI protect something in an older house and we're worried that maybe the arc fault will not hold, I'm going online and ordering GFCI only breakers, because you go into most supply houses now, you walk into a Lowe's or Home Depot, almost everything in there is a combination breaker. You're not getting just a GFCI breaker unless you just hit the lucky day. So you're going to be seeing panels full of combination breakers here soon. And what does that tell you about your cost of cures on panel replacements and such? That price is going through the roof. I told everybody, like, in terms of, I get cost of cure calls all the time for, how much should I put on this? How much should I put on that? Basically, with the new changes that we talked about with the disconnect outside and the surge protection and everything, y'all should already have raised your prices about $1,000 for a service change, just with what's already got rolled out at the beginning of the year, especially like local guys that are inspecting in Richmond and Henrico. That's about $1,000 difference. A client had reached out about an estimate last year and sat on it for several months, and he called me in February, and I was like, hey, well, I'm glad, you're one of those people that I'm really glad I put that 30-day statement at the bottom of the quote saying, hey, this is good for 30 days, because now if I replace your panel, I've got to put a disconnect outside, which means I have to run new SER cable. I can't just, use the cable that was coming from the meter already, and do a surge protection. So you're already at $1,000 difference from what you were last year if you haven't updated that on your cost of cure. But once these other code changes come out, and they're going to want you GFCI protecting what you're not AFCI protecting, just so you know, like a single pole 15 or 20 amp breaker, depending on the manufacturer, like standard square D or like Eaton black handle breaker, $7 or $8. These GFCI and AFCI breakers are $65 and up. That's our cost, not, depends on, a lot of these companies that are 50% markup and that kind of thing. And that's a big difference when you've got a 30 to 40 circuit panel. So panel prices and panel changes are going to go way up with some of this stuff. When I sat through my code update class to renew my electrical license, it was basically 30 electricians in a room complaining that, the circuit breaker companies are running the industry, deciding, what becomes code. Because if you don't think Eaton and Square D and all these guys have, some say and, some lobbying for some of these code changes, you're mistaken.
So what is a good number now for a panel upgrade?
A panel upgrade in Richmond, like if you're going to get it permitted and everything, locally here, I know we've got some guys from out of town, so that I can't speak for like Northern Virginia or anything like that. But when I saw a panel change the other day, a quote from Michael and Sons was $7,500. So now that's Michael and Sons, that's, James River, that's WH Fur or whatever, the guy that's like smiling out the back of the truck, that guy, we've all seen him going on the road. So, the larger companies, they're way up there, but I mean, if we're doing the disconnect and all that stuff, I mean, your number should not be below 3 for a panel change at all now. I would, I don't know how, I know everybody does their cost share a little different. We adopted a system where we kind of do minimums. We say like this plus, I've never been a fan of saying that something's gonna cost between $5,000 and $15,000. I mean, come on, like where are we? Are we 15 in, are we 5 in, where are we at? So, a lot of times we'll do like hey, I know that you can get it done for this, but you call this one foundation company and they're gonna be this, but if you call JES, it's gonna be twice that, we've all run into that. So yeah, panel replacement, a good price around here is like 3,500 plus. Cause you can go find some reasonable guys that'll be in the 3s, maybe low 4s. But if they go and talk to one of these, the bigger companies that these guys on the trucks are making commission, not hourly rate, you're gonna see numbers $7,000 or $8,000. And, technically, with the new codes that are out, if it's permitted, you can't just do a box swap that people used to call it. You're not just pulling the box out, using the same cable that was coming from the meter. You've got to put the disconnect on the outside. You've got to run new SER. You've now got to put a whole house surge in it. There's other stuff that's just been added to it.
And that will all fall into that 3,500 number.
Yeah, the 35 is like the super, reasonable, maybe he's one guy in a truck, maybe he's got 2 or 3 guys. But yeah, I would say like, if you're finding somebody that's doing it for $2,500, I would question. Maybe they had a slow day, they were trying to fill or something. I'm not gonna say that they're not doing it right, but if it's in the 2s, you gotta deal. Mike?
So then, how Virginia tends to do the grandfather, if it was that way originally, you don't have to upgrade. So in this case, that's not true. You do have to put that outside disconnect regardless.
Yeah, and the whole, grandfather thing, I've only had one inspector ever tell me like, oh, you could have done it this way because it was grandfathered. And I mean, I think it was back in like February. We had that big storm that, half of Richmond was out of power, like, February, March of this year. I can't remember when exactly it was. But I knew about the disconnect rule, but I just hadn't come across the surge protector rule. But I think it was like February or March, they had adopted it in January, and we failed a service change just because we didn't put the surge protection in. So, the whole like grandfather thing, I haven't run across many county inspectors that are, really honoring that. I mean, most of the time when you get into grandfather, you're talking to a listing agent, not county. I mean, all that, but I'm not lying. All right. And I've got a lot of questions about the NEC specifically prohibits the installation of receptacle outlets below the countertop work surface. That seems to be a topic every time anybody wants to ask questions that comes up. When I had that 2.5 hour kumbaya with that Hanover guy where we, spent all afternoon at that house, I picked his brain extensively on that. And basically when that new code comes out, you're not gonna have any receptacles below the counter surface on an island or a peninsula. They were requiring it before. But basically the thought process there is, some kid somewhere ran up, grabbed a cord, pulled a crock pot on top. That's what that code is for. But they are saying that they have to make provisions for future installation of some type. If there's a finished basement or something where you can't get back under it, the wiring should be under there to be connected to later. Basically what everyone has told me is like basically the pop-up receptacles in the granite, is basically gonna be the new requirement if you're gonna have these receptacles in peninsulas or islands. But everybody knows, including the inspector that I had that extensive talk with it on, that the provisions for later means after you move in, they're gonna get the electrician to come cut them into the cabinets like they've always been doing. So at this point, we're putting, if it's a first floor with a crawl space, you know, we're putting the junction boxes under the island with the circuits already there labeled. Where they can just shoot up into the cabinet to do it later. A lot of people, if there's like a finished basement under it, they're gonna start seeing junction boxes in the bottom of the cabinets that can be tapped into later. But there's gonna be a lot of electricians coming back after the occupancy permit's been issued, you know, putting them in the counters because people want them. And who wants to drill their granite, you know, for a receptacle? You know, people that are super techy and, you know, some high-end houses, we've done them. But most people don't want to drill into their granite and have some ugly contraption that pops out of their countertops. Question? Or did I already answer it? Well, okay.
Yeah, I think you answered Joe. Guys, Joe is very knowledgeable in this, so let's ask questions. We have a chance, he's very educational. So if you need a mic, raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you. But let's ask a question, get them answered. Thank you.
Hollis gives me too much credit. Sometimes I'm figuring this out like everybody else, so. All right, so one of the things that I see, written up incorrectly sometimes is knowing the difference in what the homeowner is responsible for and what the power company is responsible for. And basically, you know, anything on the house, I would write up as, you know, the homeowner's responsibility, because it depends on the service provider. And I found out years ago that even Dominion, it depends on which location you're dealing with as to what their responsibility is. You're shaking your head, so you've done this before, but, you know, for years, I'm not from Hanover, so I mean, for years and years and years, I did most everything north of the river. And it was always, you know, the power company supplied the meter, but the electrician installed it. And they come in and hook it up. So, you know, we would run our SD cable from the panel to the meter, leave it rolled up in there, and then they would come down the house with the service drop. They would come down with the SD cable. You know, they're doing the weatherhead, they're bringing the cable down to the meter, everything. We did a service change years ago in Southside, and they came out, and I got a call from the guy on the truck, and he's like, "Hey, you didn't run the SD cable up this house and put the weatherhead and everything up there for us." And I said, I've never done that. And they're like, "Yeah, we're the south side of the Dominion office. We're not the north." And I'm like, "You're kidding me. You're the same company and y'all have that drastic difference of policy." So unless you want to try to figure out what every jurisdiction is doing, I would write up the, you know, whether it's the service, you know, mast, you know, hanging off the house, whether it's the weatherhead hanging off the house, unless it's the line, you know, coming from the pole, I would put it in your report as, you know, it possibly being the homeowner's expense. Because like the south side Dominion office, it is. North of the river, sometimes it's not. You know, sometimes the cable coming from the weatherhead down to the meter, the Dominion will come out and replace it, but not always. Rappahannock, some of these co-ops, most of them, you gotta run your own SD cable up to the weatherhead. So you're better off not, you know, writing it up as, "Oh, just call Dominion after you move in," and then find out that they have an expense that you told them they didn't have. So if it's on the house, I would write it up as their expense, write it up as a fix, not just contact the utility provider. So frequently overlooked things. I mean, I've seen a lot of people that just really don't inspect much of it. They just assume it's the responsibility of the service provider. Real quick, you can tell me when you walk up to a meter and if you're going to touch it and see if it's secured to the house or whatever, how do you approach it and touch it? Yeah, you lick the two fingers and you grab the ground rod and you now you always want to touch stuff with the back of your hand. Because if you do get zapped, you know, you touch it with the back of the hand, you go, well, you know, you touch it with your hand, it might, you know, your muscle gonna contract. And you get shocked, ask me how I know. So you don't wanna touch it with an open hand and, you know, then next thing you know, you're grabbing it and it's counterproductive. But when we see a lot of meters that aren't securely attached to the house, you know, a lot of times siding contractors will, you know, take rotten masonite out, put vinyl behind it and never even, you know, they're not opening that meter to put, you know, screws back in it. So we see them just completely hanging off the house half the time. Deteriorated SE cable and inadequate sealant where the cable enters, the top of the meter. So I've got a couple pictures here. I think a lot of that.
Excuse me, Joe, we got a question from the online audience about the new electrical code. He's asking, when will the new electrical code go into effect?
That, when they adopt it, I mean, it's always crazy because, you know, when we pull permits, you know, you'll go out to like Gloucester or somewhere and they're on like 2015 or something, you know, it's like, what, you know, they're way behind. And, like I said, Henrico and Richmond just updated to the previous code, so they're one behind. A lot of counties further out are two behind, and like for example, the Federal Reserve of Richmond, they have their own electrical department, and they do their own inspections because they don't allow people on the premises. And the day the new code comes out, they say, hey, we're on this code. So that question just depends on where you are, but they're almost never like current. You know, in 3 years, they usually don't adopt it in the 3 years that it's the new code. It's usually like, okay, we're year 4 or 5. Let's adopt the one that came out, you know, years ago. And we'll just be 2 years behind instead of 5.
Shane, did you have a question? Shane, did you have a question?
No, sorry.
So things to look for on the outside. The SE cable is a deteriorated. You see that picture on the left. And you see the picture in the middle, you know, where the sealant, you know, that sealant needs to be good where the SE comes in. Because I've seen it several times where you either have the picture on the left or the picture in the middle, you know, water can get into that cable. And you see how in the picture on the left, it comes out of the bottom of the meter, it shoots through the wall, and then it 90s down again into the top of the electrical panel. I've gotten a lot of calls in rainstorms where people are freaking out and saying, I've got water in my electrical panel. It's running out of the panel onto the floor. I've got no idea where it's coming from. The wall is dry, everything above it's dry, but my electrical panel is literally spewing water all over the floor. And usually it's that sealant at the top, or it's that the cable either above the meter or below the meter looks like the picture on the left. Water gets inside of the cable and basically uses that as a raceway to go right, and it comes out of the connector, like I have that picture on the right with the arrow. So it's actually dripping out of the inside of your SE cable into your panel, soaking your breakers, and you know, so that's a bad call to get, you know, a couple months after you do an inspection. Because talking somebody off of that freak out show was rough, you know, when they've got water pouring out of their panel on Saturday night in a rainstorm. So that's one of the things that I urge guys to look at, because that can become a big problem really quickly and hard to explain when they're like, oh, I paid you to look at this house, and you know, it's been 2 weeks and I've got water pouring in my panel. So that's one of those little things that I've noticed over the years turn into big problems that I urge people to look at. Some of this stuff is pretty simple. One of the things that at least Hanover is in talks with right now, they're talking about an energy savings program where he told me they didn't know when they were going to start enforcing it, but basically there are a lot of places are rolling out with occupancy sensor switches in pantries, closets, laundry rooms. Like you're gonna be seeing a lot of that coming out where like that's required to use those, where like people aren't, you know, kids not leaving the closet light on for 2 weeks, things like that. But also a lot of your exterior lighting are gonna start requiring the photo cells. So we already have it in our language in our report, in our agreement. that, hey, exterior, we'll certainly flip switches and see what comes on, but we make no guarantee that your exterior lighting, is gonna work at midnight. We're out here at 1 p.m., it's broad daylight, and we're not gonna get up on a ladder and put tape over all the photo cells and make sure they're working. So make sure you specify in your agreements or in your report or however you wanna do it, what you're standing behind on the exterior lighting, because most of it's gonna have photo cells going forward, depending on where you are. One of the things that I see a lot are exterior receptacles without the WR, the weather resistant rating on the device. You'll usually see the WR in the blue writing or the gray writing. A lot of the new ones, it's just kind of engraved in the plastic, so it's really hard to see. But yeah, if you have an exterior outlet, no matter if it's, you need to have a proper exterior cover, but even if you have the bubble covers and whatever, it still has to be a weather resistant, weather rated receptacle. We see a lot of times the electrician doesn't have that specific one on the truck, and he throws a normal like interior GFCI in, and that's what you find. Everybody's seen, Romex on the exterior, especially under decks and things like that. Even if it's running under a deck, you've got water dripping between the deck boards and stuff, like you should have UF conduit, seal tight, any of that. I know that we're not supposed to talk about code on inspections and stuff, but one of the biggest things I see on new construction or 11-month warranty inspections is the service receptacle for the HVAC units, both, attic and outside. You have to have a service receptacle. The HVAC guys have always been on us, getting our codes updated, making their jobs easier, because, God forbid they stretch an extension cord from the front porch to the side of the house to service the unit. And it still won't be level or have clean condenser fans when they leave, but they got their receptacles that can get us with.
Does that have to be GFCI?
What's that?
Does that have to be GFCI?
Yeah, all the exterior receptacles have to be GFCI. That's been that way for years. So exterior wise, any questions or concerns there? All right. Frequently overlooked defects with regards to panels. We talked about the grounding and stuff already. Ground and neutral properly separated in the panel. We talked about, sub panel versus panel. One of the things that I've seen recently is I was called out to a house, and the inspector wrote up that the exterior, the detached garage panel didn't have the grounds and neutrals properly separated. And I saw like in his picture that it looked like a main panel. It didn't have SDR, it had SE cable coming into it. It didn't have any kind of UF or anything that looked like it would have been coming from the house. It was 200 amp cable, which you're not going to see a 200 amp breaker in most house panels, like feeding a detached garage. And it didn't have like an isolated neutral or anything. And I'm sitting there looking at the panel, I'm like, I swear that looks like a main panel. Like maybe it's the wrong picture, and that's the picture from the panel in the house. I got out there, and there was a piece of plywood leaned up inside of the house. I plopped the plywood down, there's a meter there. So he had written it up as a detached building sub panel, and it actually was its own service. So, when you're doing these garages, I know when you go out to some of these houses that have stuff leaned everywhere and wheelbarrows along the way, make sure there's not a meter on the outside of it before you start, inspecting it like a sub panel. One thing that I see people not writing up frequently, and sometimes we come in like not long after somebody bought a house, is they're all looking for discoloration in the bus bars. That's a sign of overheating. That's usually a panel replacement. If you have like the aluminum colored bars, a lot of times you can see them. You usually don't see them down below the breakers because not a lot of power has been pulled through because they're on the other side of the breakers. But you can really see a couple inches sometimes between the main breaker and where the standard breakers start. And if you've got, gold colored or starting to brown or anything like that, like you've had some overheating in that panel. And once they start turning colors and stuff, like that's a compromised bus bar. So I will say that's, we show up to, replace a breaker that's oversized or something like that, or separate the grounds and neutrals, like some little knick-knack write-ups. The next thing you know, we're having a discussion about panel replacement. That's something to definitely be looking for, so that if an electrician's coming behind you, that's a pretty easy catch. Differentiating double tapping of breakers versus neutrals. It was the early 2000s that they came out and said you can't have anything on a lug with a neutral. So panels from the 80s, 90s, it was the gentleman's way of doing it in the electrical trade to put the ground and neutral from that circuit under the same screw, because the next guy wouldn't have to figure out, which, okay, well, is this ground and this neutral go to the same Romex? They were already in the same lug. You already knew that they went together. But in the early 2000s, they rolled out the code where you couldn't have anything double tapped with neutral. I see write-ups all the time or an agent will call me and say, hey, how much would you charge to come out and correct some double taps in the panel? And my question is, well, is it double tap breakers or is it double tap neutrals? Because if y'all want to get into like the grandfather argument, the double tap neutrals might, be grandfathered. We're certainly glad to fix it, but the double tap breaker is a real safety hazard. So sometimes, they'll wave the red flag and say you've got, these dangerous violations, and it's just a 1995 panel with, the ground and neutrals, under the same lug. So sometimes just a couple extra words to describe what you have versus just checking a box that says double tap, it's dangerous, call an electrician, can go a long way on, if somebody's gonna actually call an electrician out there to fix it, or, how dangerous really, is it at that point, because the double tap breaker is way more dangerous than those double tap neutrals that have been there for 30 years. Separate circuits sharing a neutral. I've seen this written up about 50 different ways. A lot of people call it's a 240 volt circuit, sharing a neutral. It's not a 240 volt circuit. You've got two 15 amp breakers and, and houses that people have done, after the fact wiring, it's one thing, but the most common place that we see it is dishwasher and disposal. How many times have you seen a dishwasher and disposal right next to each other in the panel, two separate breakers? And the telltale sign is you have a red wire. If you have a red wire and it's not a double breaker, you probably have a double circuit sharing neutral. And basically what that is they ran a 12-3 or a 14-3 wire that just has that extra, it has a red wire in it. But you should have a double breaker on that, because keep in mind, that neutral could have current on it. It's any kind of difference in potential, that kind of thing. So the thought process there, and the reason why it is a safety issue, is let's say the dishwasher repairman shows up to fix the dishwasher. He turns the dishwasher breaker off. He's under there messing around with the wires, or maybe he just, the neutral sitting up against a metal housing or something. Somebody flips on the disposal, you get a little current on that neutral. He didn't know it taking the panel cover off, that, you had to turn both of those breakers off for that neutral to then be completely safe. It's not a huge deal in houses. It was a much bigger deal in commercial settings where you had a lot of fluorescent lighting, what they call like dirty power, where you would actually have a good amount of power coming back on that neutral. You talk to a lot of commercial guys and they'll tell you like a neutral, getting shocked by a neutral hurts worse than the hot. And I can attest to that.
Hey, Joe.
You may be getting this. I was just curious now that surge protectors are required. I see those installed around all the time. Can you give us an overview of what you would expect for on a surge protector?
There's not much to them. They just wire either to a breaker, or you see the ones that actually go into a panel like a breaker. Obviously they have the green lights on them showing that they're working or not working. So if you come across one and it's got the indicator lights and the indicator lights aren't on, then you've got a dead surge protector that's not working. So that's one thing to check. You know, a lot of people write up, because Michael and Sons and some of the other companies, that's one of their best upsells on their way out, is to put this surge protector in for you. A lot of people write up, you know, they'll have a surge protector with like little, like number 14 wires, and they'll take it to like a 50 amp breaker. So I see a lot of people write up like, okay, it's an oversized breaker. You know, you could step it down. A lot of times they put the larger breakers on there. But I mean, when you've got, you know, there's the 6-foot tap rule and stuff where, you know, if it's right there in the panel, yeah, I usually leave that. But when you say like install it properly, like what kind of things?
I see the surge protector inside the panel a lot. I was thinking they're supposed to be mounted on the outside. I see them basically double tapping a breaker instead of having a dedicated breaker. When I read installation instructions, it says you should have dedicated breaker top near the service, where the main disconnect. I see wires running all over the place instead of as short as possible. And these are things I've read in actually installation instructions, and I'm just curious if you call those out.
Yeah, I mean, you know, any kind of like your normal electrical violations, you know, we see them double tapped into the mains all the time. I've even seen an alligator clipped over the mains. I mean, I've seen everything you can think of. But yeah, like your normal electrical inspecting, you know, should take care of most of that. You know, double tap breaker, no. Double tap main, no. You know, not having a connector where it comes in the panel, no. But from there, like a lot of it's manufacturer specifications. And like I said, with like the EV chargers and stuff, we're not gonna pull it, we're not gonna research every piece of equipment in this house and figure out if it's permitted by the manufacturer or not. So we write up like the basics, and you know, if somebody proves us wrong with an instruction manual or something, you know, that just is what it is. We don't have time to check all of that.
So how should they be connected?
Well, I mean, you have some of them that just clip right on that breaker basically. So I mean, some of them, they're gonna be in a breaker space. Now that you have the plug on neutral, some of them won't even have the pigtail coming off of them going to the neutral bar, some of them will. And then the ones that, you know, wire into a breaker, they should be wired into a designated 240-volt breaker. And yeah, you're correct. I mean, like, you want to have it as close to the main, you know, you don't want it to be all the way at the bottom of the panel. But you know, once you get into that kind of stuff, you know, hey, is it installed correctly? Is it double tapped? You know, I wouldn't write up like, hey, it's at the bottom of the panel versus the top. Once you start getting into like manufacturers' recommendations and stuff, I'd stay away from that.
Hey, Joe. You're gonna talk all about Federal Pacific.
I have that in here, so we can definitely get to that, yeah. So I've seen guys write up the circuits here in a neutral, they call them 240-volt circuits, that's not what they are. I've seen them written up as many different things. So this is an example statement that we've had in our reports, the way we write it up. In the main electrical panel, there are 2 separate circuits on separate breakers that are sharing a neutral, which is a potential safety hazard. It is recommended to replace the 2 single-pole breakers with a proper 2-pole breaker. Yeah, I mean, I've got, like I said, some of the Hunter? Mine's, I got one screen and that's the other screen. I've got one screen, it's different there. I can certainly go off of that one. Here it's not running. Yeah. Well, one isn't, so even if I do them here, it's not. No, thanks. See, I'm on the side, that was one on the Honda. Sorry, just tell you. All right. So yeah, it's not a 240-volt circuit, it's not all these other things, it's two circuits that are sharing a neutral. And I've learned over the years that sometimes explaining stuff to old school electricians who've been doing it this way since the 70s are the hardest people to explain it to. So the way I write it up, so they don't call me and we have to argue about it, is in the main electrical panel, there are two separate circuits on separate breakers that are sharing a neutral, which is a potential safety hazard. It is recommended to replace the two single pole breakers with a proper 2-volt breaker. I know we're not supposed to tell people how to fix things, but I've gotten more questions about this thing over the years than anything else, I feel like. And a lot of times agents and stuff will overlook it. So I always put the potential safety hazard. I make sure that's included. I make sure that I specify that they're on two separate breakers, because a lot of times, you know, the old school electricians have a question about that. A lot of times people are like, I just don't get it. I mean, that one's pretty cut and dry. So I realize that, you know, saying what the fix is usually considered overstepping, but that's a pretty simple statement and it clears up a lot of confusion and callbacks for us.
Would a handle tie suffice?
Yeah, it's a proper one, but most of the time you're gonna show up and somebody's gonna have piece number 12 running through the holes and then over it.
Or nail.
Yeah. That's good.
Hey, George. Question, human trust.
What that?
Human trust. He has a disconnect outside. We have the main panel on the other side of the wall of the garage. No main breakers. What would you say?
And the panel on the inside?
Yes.
As long as you have the disconnect on the outside, you don't need the breaker inside.
Why is that? Because,
You have a main disconnecting means. That's a sub panel in the house.
but the code says it should be on the same location. That's two separate locations. Also, they refer to these are disconnect 2 to 6, not 1 to 6.
I mean, you're gonna see a ton of panels, you know, that, because they have the knockout at the top that I'm sure you're seeing, like not knocked out, but you have your main disconnecting means on the outside. Some you're gonna see them all over town as, you know, that's a sub panel in the house.
Technically it is, but I'm struggling to see it's a safety device to have. And so you would say as an electrician, you know, home spec with that, it would be okay because they tell them it's not okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't write it up as like you need two main disconnects. You have your main disconnect
Well,
right there.
it's not a main disconnect, it's a disconnect for the panel. Because the way I read the code is you need to disconnect the cover and the board if they're not in the same location. Being in the garage and outside, they are not same location.
Well, like I said, once you have that main disconnect, that is your main service. That is your main service, that is your main disconnect. And anything from there is considered a sub panel. So like even though it is your panel with all your house breakers in it, that is a sub panel. That's not your main service. And that's not your main disconnect. Yeah, you can have it there. You can have, you know, a 200 amp disconnect on one side of the wall, and literally on the back side of the wall, you can have a 200 amp disconnect. But that indoor panel is a sub panel.
I understand that this thought that applies when it the secondary to the main
Standards, because. Get through this phone and turn you on. Yes, the numbers. We're talking about the language about being 6 means or less of disconnected, not being the same location. You know, and we should have a disconnect for each family.
No, I fully agree. I'm just telling you, like, that's the way they're classified and that's the way that they're doing.
Yeah, because I see a lot of people really trying to cut the cost like. You see, there's.
Yeah, pretty much all the new construction you're gonna be seeing, you're just gonna see that knockout at the top of the panel in the garage that's not knocked out with the right. So, I mean, you can fight that with builders, you can fight that with the county, but they're not gonna do it.
You see, not caught up, you know, you're not. Yes. Shit, some of these have, they do it, towards me, or. You get skipped. 3,200, I think. This
All right, ask you shall see Federal Pacific. So can we all agree that Federal Pacific needs to be replaced? Can we just get that out of the way? I don't care if you're married to a listing agent or whatever, like, you're never gonna convince me that it was grandfather. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm kind of nervous. Is there any way that you could provide a couple pictures of the discoloration of the bus bars?
Yeah, I thought I had it in here, but, maybe I have a separate like panel presentation that maybe that was in.
That'd be great, thank you very much.
Yeah, I can certainly, you know, I can certainly find some if they're not in here. But, all right, so Federal Pacific. You talk to, you know, a different person, you'll get a different story on, you know, what the actual chain of events with Federal Pacific panels were. At the end of the day, they're a safety hazard and, you know, safety overrides grandfather or recalled or class action lawsuit, any of that, you know, it is a safety hazard, it needs to be replaced, period. I had a very mad listing agent call me one time because one of my inspectors that worked for me just used the word recall. They were never recalled. They were never a recall. So you talk to a lot of electricians that want to make a case for a grandfather or whatever, they will bring that up. Basically, the Consumer Safety Commission, you know, launched an investigation into Federal Pacific in the 80s, and Federal Pacific was about bankrupt. So they actually abandoned the investigation and never fully recalled it. So they basically, you know, didn't have the research, they were, you know, cutting costs and basically the Reagan administration was, you know, cutting a lot of government funding and programs and things. So they just said, hey, you know, Federal Pacific is all but dead, so let's stop, you know, spending the money to put them out of business. They're almost out of business anyway, so the recall never actually happened. So my guy said that they were a recall, and, you know, the listing agent went down a bunch of rabbit holes online and actually said, hey, you know, your guy said the wrong thing, you know, you're out here. And I said, look, we know he said the wrong word, it still needs to be replaced. You know, you can argue it 10 different ways, but that's what it is. One thing to specify in the reports is that it's a stab lock panel. Keep in mind that Federal Pacific manufactured more things than just these residential stab lock panels. Federal Pacific actually manufactured a commercial series that are still, you know, in use and not considered a safety hazard to this day. So, you know, I've never got a call back on this, but I've seen in like home inspector Facebook pages and electrician Facebook pages. And I tell you what, there is nobody that loves to bash home inspectors more than some old school contractors. And some of these discussions, they're just like, ah, that idiot home inspector, he wrote up this panel or that panel. And I'm just like, wow, I need to stay out of this one. But, you know, to somebody who's not familiar with the home inspection industry, but is very familiar with the electrical industry, just seeing Federal Pacific isn't a red flag. You know, they're working on these things in commercial settings all the time. So the key word in your report, you need to have a stab block specified. Some old head electricians might, you know, call and say, well, hey, I'm not riding out there and get the front stab block. Like I said, they were never officially recalled, so don't, you know, say that they were recalled. You just need to stick to that they are, you know, a known fire hazard and that they need to be replaced. Fun fact, most electricians that you talk to will not work on one. So if they decide to, oh, I'm just gonna keep it, it's been here since the eighties, you know, obviously it's not one of the bad ones because it never, you know, caught on fire, you know, they've known that they're forever. Basically what happened with the Federal Pacific panels was the breakers weren't tripping when they were supposed to. So just because the house hasn't burned down in the last 30 years, that doesn't mean that the guy moving in isn't gonna plug in 8 space heaters on one circuit and the breaker never trips. You know, different people have different uses for their electrical system in their house. So, you know, the old lady that, you know, does nothing but watch TV and turn on a few lamps, it's never been an issue, but the guy that moves in and is growing weed in the closet with all these grow lamps and stuff, you know, next thing you know, it's a problem, you know. So, you know, a lot of people, a lot of real estate professionals, a lot of old school electricians will argue that it's a grandfathered thing and, you know, hey, they were never recalled. You know, but I tell people all the time, and sometimes when my guys call me and they say, you know, I'm kind of on the fence on, you know, writing this up as a green statement or a red statement. A lot of times, you know, rule of thumb, and this is just me, I didn't read this anywhere or anything. Keep in mind, people love Google. And you know, if you're not writing up Federal Pacific panels as a replace, I urge you to Google Federal Pacific panel and see what your clients are going to pull up when they Google that. And, you know, if you're playing the grandfather game, you're going to get, you know, in trouble at some point. Let's see. So yeah, stating that it's a safety hazard, stating that it's a fire hazard, stating that it's a known fire hazard, specifying that it's stab lock, and calling for a replacement is, you know, needed. Okay. John, I see you.
I was just going to add something along the Federal Pacific. Years ago, I actually chaired a committee for A, and we were looking into this, and it was probably back in the early 2000s. And I actually ended up talking to one of the engineers who studied these things, and his comment was, don't mistake that just because they won't recall that they're safe. He said they're absolutely not safe. He's on any home inspector should be right about. They're not safe. And also, in a court in New Jersey actually ruled that they were their UL was fraudulently being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So that was we heard.
Yeah, one of the things I bring up, like when people question it is, you know, all these years later, you know, I had my own reporting app for a while. All of our reports are, you know, we built our own template and all that stuff. But years ago when I started in the trade, like a lot of y'all, I had the A-hit software, like the checkbox A-hit, you know, the you know, cookie cutter check mark one. And y'all, those of you that, you know, dealt with A-hit, y'all remember the A-hit report where it had the Federal Pacific was specified with a check mark, you know, even like national software and stuff, you know, has Federal Pacific as like a red flag. Go ahead.
Well, I can vouch on Federal Pacific. I've seen melted sheet next to their breakers, but what language you use to describe functionally obsolete? And it's like Cisco, Pushmatic, not good. Fuse boxes that are still out there. Like, do you have a specific language or statements that you recommend?
I mean, I guess maybe because I am an electrician, mine are usually kind of catered to the situation. A lot of inspectors use auto comments, and I don't really believe in auto comments, because how, one house is different from the other, and a lot of real estate agents and stuff hate like copy and paste that they've seen on every other report, so most of our statements are catered to the house. So to answer your question, I don't really have like a standard statement. But if something is unsafe or, like a Federal Pacific panel, I mean, I think my next slide, I have like written up my statement for Federal Pacific. But I don't have like any cookie cutter for certain statements. We just objectively, point out what it is.
And you were talking about the acceleration of the bus bar. I run into a lot of old exterior panels, especially on apartment buildings, they're mounted outside, and the inner cover is rusted and corroded. And it's rusting around the breaker itself. Would you call that a defect in its own way?
Yeah, keep in mind, any kind of corrosion, rust, that kind of stuff can lead to loose connections, especially. I mean, how many times have you taken off an exterior panel cover and all the screws on the breakers are rusted? We call for, evaluation and repair, replacement of breakers, like I said, I don't have cookie cutter copy and paste statements. But yeah, a little bit of rust like on the bottom of the can or something, we try not to, throw the red flag for everything. But, if you've got corrosion, rust on actual electrical components, like if you've got corrosion on the bus bars, if you've got rust on the screws for the breaker, we're definitely writing that up, because, a lot of times that's a panel replacement, depending on how corroded. So just keep in mind, back there, if that breaker sits on the bus bar, you've probably got some corrosion, oxidation, things like that. If you've got a panel that's had a lot of moisture in it, to the point where it's rusting and all that. So yeah, I mean, if you're seeing those telltale signs, unless it's like a little bit of rust on the can or something, you should be calling for, at least for an electrician to come out and, take a look at it and replace what's needed. Because I mean, just like, aluminum wiring or any of that you can possibly get a little corrosion where the wire connects. I mean, if you've got rust and everything like right there at that plug, you could be getting into some loose connections and stuff at that point.
Going along with his comment, do you find that there is an age that you would defect a panel on? 25-year-old panel, 50-year-old panel?
That's a question that I need to look into, because I've heard of people calling for replacements at certain years, and that's something I've never done as a home inspector. If something's 30 years old, I don't just say, hey, it needs to be replaced. That's kind of like the old, like, how many times have people asked you how long that 15 or 16-year-old HVAC unit's gonna last? If I inspect the panel, I report the defects that are in it. But just if something's old, I don't, say, hey, it needs to be replaced. To honestly answer your question, I don't know if there's, some kind of rule that I don't know about. I did see a local company write up a panel recently. The homeowner sent me the report because they were super mad at them. And they had some language in there where like, hey, the panel's from the house was built in the 80s, and they said, hey, the panel is original to the house, we recommend replacement. And I said, hey, I disagree, like, sure, let's fix that double tap breaker and let's, get it cleaned up. But as an electrician, I don't agree with like, hey, it's a 1988 build, let's rip the panel out and replace it. So that you can imagine, they called me because they were not happy with the inspector. So, like I said, I don't know if there's a rule somewhere in, like in the home inspection industry that I don't know about. But I don't know of any code or anything that says like, hey, it's 30 years old, rip it out and change it.
Yeah, going over panels. Companies go to.
I think your mic is off.
Lit up.
There you go.
Okay. So in over panels, the companies are out of business. They're not manufacturing replacement breakers. We're seeing mismatched breakers, panels. And so under those kind of conditions, what can you typically expect with an older panel with mismatched breakers, or the fact that you can't get, replacement parts?
Well, keep in mind, a lot of the companies that are out of business have been bought by other manufacturers. Like right off the top of my head, Murray, Siemens breakers are approved to go in Murray panels. So, that is something that, you could familiarize yourself with or keep a cheat sheet. Because even Federal Pacific, they didn't go out of business, they got bought out by another company and they continue to produce them. So, that most of that information is, findable online pretty easily. But I mean, everybody knows that most of the black handles stand like a Square D and a Siemens and a Cutler Hammer CH or BR series that has the black handle, they'll go into each other's panels. Most of them will fit, but if you look up the manufacturer specifications, they tell you what's allowed in that panel. So any of your Murray stuff, you're gonna see a lot of Siemens breakers in there. I mean, quite frankly, in other houses, you're gonna see all kinds of breakers mismatched usually. And yeah, I mean, technically, the manufacturer specifies what breakers are, okay for their enclosures. And you just have to stick with that in terms of the mismatch. In terms of like obsolete parts and everything, you get into, almost any equipment, that's the same conversation. Like, can it be fixed? Does it have a problem, number one? I wouldn't start writing up things like, hey, there's nothing wrong with this panel, but it's no longer in production, so you should change it. But if you do have defects, that is something, if you're worried about it, like, hey, I've got a problem here and I don't know if the parts are available, that's when you, pass it along to the electrical contractor and make that call. I would be careful in terms of saying what's fixable and what's not. If y'all are having, conversations with people and, I know most people are using, infrared technology now and everything. With the, everybody knows the Murray humpback breakers, right? The ones that have the hump in the front of them, the main breaker. There is one main breaker that we stock at the shop, and that is that breaker. Because those go bad all the time. Those go onto the bus bar. Just on the bus bar, barely looks different at the top, and they just go on. They're not, bolted in like most of them. So, once they start getting a little loose in the back, they start heating up. And, one of my buddies who I went through apprenticeship with, he says he loves Murray panels because, the most of his service changes come from those. So if you're, taking your infrared technology and scanning the panel, those Murray humpback breakers are definitely one to look at, are they heating up and stuff. Mike?
So it's not just the red breakers.
Yeah, all of those Murray, they call them, humpbacks.
Yeah.
Pretty much all of them are starting to fail.
Okay, because I always wrote up the red ones, but.
Yeah. We don't discriminate on color around here.
So for replacement breakers that are potentially approved for use, who makes those determinations?
The manufacturer. The manufacturer basically specifies, like Murray has specified that like Siemens breakers are approved. That's something if you're finding mismatched breakers, that's just a judgment call on your part, whether you want to look it up or whether you just want to, pass it on. I mean, a lot of times what I tell my guys, if it's something that you're going to have to like go home and research or whatever, let's look at the situation. Is that your only thing in the panel? Then, maybe, do the research. But if you've got 2 or 3 other fixes in there and you're going to kick it to an electrician anyway, saying, hey, I've got double tap breakers, I've got double tap neutrals, I've got this, I've got that. At that point, just include it in your statement and, keep it moving, because I wouldn't spend the time on doing that if you're already going to have an electrician come out anyway.
Thank you.
All right, so, as I talked about Federal Pacific panels and rooms full of inspectors, I've gotten a lot of mixed concerns. A lot of guys have had breakers shoot out at them when they try to take the panel cover off. That's been raised to my attention before. I would say that's pretty rare. I've been in a lot of electrical, I mean, a lot of Federal Pacific panels. I've never had that happen to me. We've replaced a ton of them. I used to keep them at the shop to show them to realtors and stuff if they stop by. I've never had a situation where a Federal Pacific has, tried to fall apart on me when I took the cover off. But, my big thing about not taking the cover off is you don't know what other defects might be behind that panel cover that might be a big deal. How many of y'all have inspected the tri-levels and split foyers, over here in Henrico where they were, built in the early 70s, and taking that panel cover off was your one shot at finding that it was a solid conductor aluminum house. Stuff like that, the whole like taking a picture of the front of a Federal Pacific and saying replace, but not taking the cover off. You are leaving yourself open to possibly missing other concerns. And let's say that the people don't get the panel replaced, the next thing you know, they move in and they find out that it's an aluminum house, or, the wire going to the HVAC equipment is undersized, and, it's one of those split foyers where you got a slab under you and finish ceiling above you, or now they've got to, get a new wire all the way across the house, and it's not an easy fix. It's, in my experience, the whole like breakers shot out at me. I've heard that a couple times over the last, almost 20 years, but I've never had it happen to me, and I've been in a ton. So, our policy is that we take the panel covers off. We look for those defects that we might not find otherwise, and we've never had a problem. But I tell everybody that asks that question, you gotta make that call on your own. Have it in your agreement, have it in there that, hey, I'm not pulling it because of this reason. And they just know that like there may be some gray area there. I saw a hand back somewhere.
You answered it. Basically, if I noted the panel, could I just put in my report, stat block breakers noted at Federal Pacific panel, I'm not taking off the panel due to.
Yeah, you can.
Putting that in so they know they can evaluate it further with the electrician if they.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the reason like I said, this is one of those preference things, like I understand somebody maybe saying, hey, I'm not comfortable doing it. I'm certainly not gonna, shame anybody for not doing something they're not comfortable with. But, at the end of the day, a lot of times with Federal Pacific, it's such a replace, a lot of people, it's such a replace automatically, like, some realtors will argue and some know it right out of the gate. And when you say replacing the panel, they're not getting somebody to come out and, evaluate it. I mean, when you're saying, hey, it's a Federal Pacific, it's an automatic replace, that even if you call for that evaluation, most of the time it's not happening. So it's one of those things where, yeah, are you covered on the report? Yeah, probably. But, are you covered from that person that, has a whole aluminum house and didn't know it? Mike?
Well, perhaps a lot of those guys were just overstating what was happening. I mean, with Federal Pacific panels, a lot of times you make trip 7 breakers, taking the cover off, including the main. That has happened to me.
That has happened to me too.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, hey.
Yeah, so I mean, when you run that risk with any panel, I mean, when you're taking off a panel cover on an old panel and like, somebody slips and they, hit the main breaker, or they hit, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have had to do a slide on the bottom, they turn off like the bottom half of the left side. I mean, everybody's, probably been there. So you really run that risk with any older panel or any panel in general, but there's always that fear that like, is this main gonna reset? Nobody's turned this main off in 30 years and I just flip it, it's gonna spring it. But I mean, that's kind of the nature of the beast inspecting panels. I've seen a lot of camera, a lot of phones in the air, so I think you've already read that statement that's been up there for a while. But you had asked about like statements about panels. This is an example of the main electrical panel is the Federal Pacific stab block panel, which is a known, well-documented safety/fire hazard. In the panel, there are defects such as oversized breakers, double tap breakers, yada, yada, yada. Recommended to have a licensed electrical contractor replace the main electrical panel and all of their defects at this time. Sometimes taking that panel cover off and saying, there's other defects in this panel is what kind of, gets it over the, if people are on the fence about the whole grandfather argument, sometimes having other defects in the panel is what will get it replaced. I've had listing agents and I've had electricians, argue, hey, it's been there since 1980, whatever. It's never been a problem. We're not replacing it just because it's an outdated, practice. But then you get into, hey, well, you've got double tap breakers, you've got these other defects, and good luck finding an electrician who's gonna work on that panel and warranty his work. And at that point, you start getting into a little more like, all right, it needs to be replaced because I'm not gonna find anybody in town that's gonna work on it. Nor am I gonna, if you've got double tap breakers and you need to buy more breakers to put in there to correct the double tap breakers, you're gonna have to buy them on, eBay or something from California or somebody that still, has some and pay an astronomical amount. And any electrician is gonna have a big old statement about either, if they will even work on it, they're gonna have a big statement saying like, hey, I'll warranty my work back from the tail light leaving the driveway. So sometimes taking that panel cover off avoids the fight later of, are we replacing it or not? Because a lot of people will argue, even electricians will argue. Solid conductor aluminum. Basically, a lot of you, I've seen a lot of people write up like the grade. I mean, everybody knows like solid conductor versus like braided aluminum, like writing up one versus the other. I've seen some reports, like sadly, that it's written up as an aluminum concern, and have an electrician come out here and evaluate a couple $1,000 on the cost of cure. And I look at the cover page and it was a house built in like 2005, and I'm like, I don't think this is what y'all think this is, and it was a thing like in the early 70s was when it was the most popular. So like when you're looking up the age of the home and you're seeing, 71, 72, that's when the red flag should be, really looking for aluminum. You're not going to see a lot of solid conductor aluminum unless, somebody pulled some old wire out of a garage somewhere and decided to use it in their newer house. But it's the solid conductor aluminum that, they had the issues with. And, it's the branch circuits where, you have it go under receptacle, switches, lights, and that kind of thing. No electrician wants to get called out to a house because there's, braided aluminum running to, the air handler or something. So please, if you don't want to ask in front of everybody, catch me in the hallway and we'll talk about it. But know the difference between, what's solid conductor, what needs an electrician to look at it, and what is just aluminum wiring that people are still using to this day. So yeah, mid-60s to the mid-70s, the copper shortage, caused a lot of builders to start using aluminum. But basically, if you've got a house at this point that was built in the, the 60s or 70s that, has solid conductor aluminum, and you're seeing a bunch of newer white receptacles and switches, newer ceiling fans and all that stuff, chances are you've got some violations. You have to use the proper wire nuts, the purple wire nuts. You have to either pigtail it or use devices that say that they're approved for aluminum connections. And, all that stuff off the shelf at Home Depot that you're seeing installed as part of this fresh renovation, I can tell you it's not the right stuff. So, if you, and, on the back of it, it'll say, copper connections only. I will say, if you're inspecting, you're trying to save time and you're seeing older, like brown receptacles, like in those old bins with the wood paneling and stuff, most of those are approved for aluminum because a lot of that's original. So if you're going to try to go find a money shot, like, I know people are like, well, I'll take covers off. If I think there's not a tuber aluminum, I'll take some covers off to get a picture saying, hey, I'm not just warning of something that might not be here when we get looked into further. But yeah, those brown receptacles that look like they've been there since the 70s, don't waste your time looking into those boxes. Look in the kitchen or the bathroom that they've remodeled, and that's where you're going to find it. On like those newer white outlets and stuff. But if you're seeing yellow and red and all these wire nuts that aren't purple, like chances are you've got some improper terminations. If you're seeing newer outlets and they're not pigtailed, you're going to have some aluminum violations. And And, it's usually like a switch over aluminum house and go, have an electrician go through and clean up everything. Even just doing the purple wire nuts and the pigtails and all that stuff, it's a few $1,000s. So that's one of those things that, you need to be writing up and not just saying like, hey, it's here. And, not calling for any kind of action on it, just because, you don't see anything. We have the policy that we go a couple extra steps, pull some covers, do some things to try to get a picture show, and it usually doesn't take much effort. So I've had that conversation with inspectors about like, hey, I'm not taking off switch plates and that kind of thing. So, and then you do know that, aluminum has to be a size bigger too. So, if you've got, number 12, 120, you've got all this, you have to keep in mind that you're inspecting at a different size now. That's something to be looking for. Breakers, receptacles, switches, etc. have to be specified that aluminum connections are permitted. A lot of them say copper connections only on the back. Approved wire connectors. I mean, if you're not seeing, purple stuff, it's not the right stuff. Inspection tips. If you think you have aluminum or something, you're just not seeing enough to write up when inspecting a home, you suspect they have aluminum, solid conductor aluminum branch wiring circuits. Open the electrical panel before inspecting the rest of the house. I don't know if, everybody has their order of doing things, but, a lot of times you'll find the aluminum right there in the panel, and there'll be some wire nuts in the panel. And at that point, you don't need to go pull a cover off or something to, dig a little deeper. So, a lot of times people will start upstairs and work themselves their way down, and, the panel is one of the last things they inspect in the basement. If you're inspecting a house that was built in that time range, you're seeing black ronex or any of that stuff, a lot of times I'll pull the panel sooner than later, to see if I need to look further. Talk about improperly sized breaker, wire connectors. Most of the time I check switch boxes. Switches are usually slimmer, so you can, see behind them better than an outlet that, takes up most of the opening. And if you're seeing like the wrong color wire nuts, you're seeing that bare aluminum ground, like at that point, you got something going on. I know I'm running short on time, so when you're inspecting knob and tube as well, a lot of times the best place to look for that is in the switch box, especially on the first floor. A lot of times they'll replace everything you can see in the crawl space or the basement. There'll be fresh ronex in the attic. There might even be, fresh ronex, coming up to the receptacles on the first floor. But that run from the switch box up to the light fixture on the first floor that has no attic access, that's where the knob and tube still is, because they didn't want to, tear up the ceiling and get a new wire across. So, if you're looking for something to say, hey, you still got knob and tube that's been improperly altered, you've got aluminum that's still here. First floor switches, if you're going to pull a cover, that's where I start. So example statement for an aluminum house. There are solid conductor aluminum wire branch circuits present in the house which require specific safety measures. Safety concerns such as devices and wire connectors not approved for aluminum connections, oversized breakers, etc. were observed. It's recommended to have a licensed electrical contractor fully evaluate the aluminum circuits and repair all improper practices. I'm sorry.
Hey, Joe, you got about 4 minutes.
Okay. Sorry, I was like going button. I keep on wanting to use the mouse pad, not the arrow. Okay, so 4 minutes. Anybody have any questions that you want to talk about? I'll be here all day, so if you want to catch me in the hall too, but anything y'all want to go over? I know I didn't get to a whole lot because we spent a lot of time on questions, but that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, the receptacles, back to where the kitchen was, the receptacles underneath the countertop, is that code now, or is that you were talking about it's coming in the future?
Them prohibiting them, that's coming in the next code update. Well, it's already been released, but it hasn't been adopted yet.
Gotcha.
So like, what's that? What year? 23.
So they were not.
Yeah, I haven't seen, like, the most recent I've seen, is 21. I haven't seen anybody on 23, 24 yet.
Hope never got out ahead of it. Told everybody.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we just did a house and it was under 21, so we had to put them, you know, on a peninsula.
Did you mention in new construction that basement receptacles need to be GFCI protected, whether it's finished or unfinished?
Yeah, let me go back and, now that you have to, I'll make sure it's, yeah, so you should be seeing that now,
So why is it? Is there a reason?
yeah, just because you have a sump pump doesn't mean it's gonna work forever. You know, stuff happens, so I mean, water intrusion through the foundation, any of that. So I mean, it used to be like unfinished, and now it's like, hey, just do it regardless. What else y'all want to talk about for a minute? I got much more slides, but we're not gonna get through them, so.
Replacing non-tube wire.
So, you know, most jurisdictions say point blank, if you alter knob and tube, you replace it, period. So if you're seeing knob and tube and it's live, you need to be putting it in your report. If it's buried in insulation, it's a fire hazard right out of the gate. Like, let's just get that out of the way. So if you're in the attic and like you're seeing, you know, the little isolators and you're seeing it running through the insulation, automatic fire hazard. You know, most people aren't gonna go up there and remove all the insulation, you know, so I mean, at that point, you're getting an electrician involved. If you're seeing knob and tube running in the house and you've got no knob and tube in the panel, it's been altered. So it's been altered improperly. You know, at this point, there's not a lot of houses out there that have knob and tube that has been not touched and is still grandfathered. You know, I haven't seen one of those in years at this point.
You know, but I reckon if it's wrapped and soldered, it's okay. If you don't see that, it's not okay.
If it looks old as the hills and it hasn't been touched, you know, you can test it and stuff, but I would still make a statement that it's there. That's one of those things that, you know, knob and tube scares people to death. It needs to be in your report if it's there, period. For inspecting knob, if you're in one of those old houses that you think might have knob and tube, an inspection tip is, I turn on all the lights before I go in the attic, because keep in mind, some of that wiring goes to light fixtures. And you might go in the attic, the lights are off, and you put your tester on and it shows dead, and you say, oh, looks like it's dead, and then, you know, they turn the light switch on after you get out of the attic, and it's hot as a firecracker up there, buried in insulation. If you're seeing newer tape, if you're seeing wire nuts, if you're seeing any of this stuff, you know, you need to be getting an electrician to come out and give them a quote on replacement.